Lovely to see you all. Thank you so much for coming out on a Sunday afternoon. I say thank you, but I think actually it's going to be a treat because I'm really delighted that Burge has agreed to start this series for us, exploring the Old Testament. We call it the Old Testament, don't we? But of course, for many millions of people around the world, it is the Scriptures, the Testament. And for us, I sometimes think the title of the Old Testament makes us think it doesn't really matter as much. And it is an integral part of our Scriptures as Christians too. But I'm sure Burge will enlighten us more on that. So in a moment I'm going to hand over to Burge, who will talk to us for a while. At the end of that there'll be a chance for some questions, anything that arises from what's said.
One for each table.
And we'll finish with a short evening prayer together before we go.
Thanks.
Is anyone in need of tea or coffee that hasn't already got it?
There are too many people on this table, so you have another one.
I'm sure we could do more copies of the handouts later if people need them.
I didn't realise.
I know. You didn't know how popular you were. So I'm going to hand over to you.
Thank you. There's one more copy. If you can sort of look over this. Oh, here you are. Yes, Philip says I'm switched on. My wife never thought I was, but I found the most difficult things in my working life was afternoon meetings. But after many years, I developed the art of falling asleep with my eyes open. You can say what you like because, as most of you know, I only have 20% hearing, so I can't hear any abuse you shout at me. Clock. And just put these here. If at the end of this afternoon you think, my goodness, I've got to know so much to understand the Old Testament, then I've failed. As at our wonderful service at All Saints this morning, as Joe said, you don't have to know anything to read the Old Testament. All right, information does help considerably, but it doesn't stop the Spirit of God working in your minds and hearts when you read scriptures that He inspired. Now, you may think we've started on the right wicket. Presently, you'll find I'm a heretic. But for the moment, the Old Testament is a record of those who tried to understand the history of their nation and the dilemmas people got into, both politically and individually. They believed they had a calling from God at the beginning of the Bible, Genesis 12, not quite the beginning. Abraham was called out, and God called him to be the father of a nation, yes, but the purpose was that through him and all his descendants, the whole earth would be blessed. That was their calling. They lost sight of that a bit in their history, getting involved in self-preservation, much like we, the institutional church, often do. We lose sight of the calling and we get into bolstering up the institution, and then we have lost the plot. As individuals deviated from that calling in Old Testament, I don't like Old Testament, I call it First Testament, as many do, in First Testament times, as the writers and thinkers encountered war, bloodshed, personal calamity, they found as they wrestled with those problems, the Spirit of God enlightened them and gave them shafts of insight into being human that are true for all time. Some of it isn't true for all time. And some of it They got bang on. The Old Testament is permeated with divine insights. And here is where I become a heretic. But it is also written by human beings who got some things wrong and thought God was saying this, that, or the next thing. You older people will have been brought up on J.B. Warfield, even though you didn't know it, about divine inspiration of the Bible and the Old Testament and verbal inspiration. I can't espouse that. That creates so many problems. And I'll tell you why. But before I get there, these writers faced the same challenges of being human that we do. They wrestled with the routine calamities of life, death, bereavement, and the unroutine, the unexpected calamities of life, war, bloodshed, and all the rest of it, much like our world today, except we've got better weapons than they had. And the Spirit of God enlightened them and directed them in timeless thoughts. The problem is, you say, some of these timeless thoughts are too awful for me to take on board. If God was really responsible for the killing of thousands of people in the Old Testament, the First Testament times, then I am afraid I find it difficult to take an interest in them. I want to say this at this point, and it's a tangent sideways point. Unlike the mistake we made in the first half of the 20th century, proving that the Bible is divine inspiration or whatever you want to call it, never brought anyone to faith. Proof never brings anyone to faith. I tell you what brings people to faith. It's seeing things predominantly. Some people may come to faith because of, someone's proved to them every word of the Hebrew Bible is okay. But people predominantly come to faith because they see something real, alive and working, making sense of the calamities of life, carrying people through all the sadness and the turmoil, and yet maintaining an equilibrium that is nothing less than heavenly, I think. So that's why people come to faith, I think. You may have found it different. And the Old Testament has the power to be a tool for us in all the situations in life that we find ourselves. Not every detail, but it gives us direction as we engage with it. The same Spirit that inspired the writers begins to work in our hearts and minds and shows us the right way to go and the right things to do. And if you don't believe that, then I point you to, and I might cry in a minute, the scrap of paper that was found by the body of a dead child in the Ravensbrück concentration camp. Do you know the Ravensbrück prayer? Well, look it up on the internet. This was found on beside the body of a dead child in Ravensbrück after it had been liberated. At Ravensbrück, it was women and children that were sent there, and adolescent girls. 92,000 died there, either through being shot, murdered, and latterly the gas chambers, which arrived late at Ravensbrück. 92,000, is that about 10 times the size of Long Ashton? I don't know, something like that. And the prayer reads like this. O Lord, I'll get emotional in a minute, remember not only men and women of good will, but also those of evil will. Do not remember all the suffering they have inflicted on us. Remember the fruits we have borne thanks to this suffering, our comradeship, our loyalty, our humility, our courage, our generosity, and the greatness of heart that has come out of all this. And when they come to judgment, let all the fruits that we have borne be their forgiveness. Sorry, I need to recover. If that's the sort of power and insight the Old Testament gives a Jewish lady, and they were Jewish, someone brought up in the scriptures of the First Testament, if that's what it does, then I want to buy into it. I don't know about you, but I want you to compare that for a minute. Turn to Psalm 137. And the last verse, verse 9. And there you read this, something like this. I don't know which version you've got. O Babylon the destroyer. This is written by someone in captivity, in exile, when they were taken away from Judea and into Babylon, the whole lot. It says, Babylon the destroyer. Blessed are they who take your children and dash them against the rocks. Compare that with the Ravensbrook prayer. We will discuss at the end if there's time. But that shows me, you may think the Ravensbrook lady got it all wrong, one was a bit gone up here. But that shows me that what you do to people if you oppress them, Psalm 137, but it shows me that even in that situation, God can do something more wonderful. Psalms that show the bad side of human nature, and as well as the weak sides, as Psalm 137 does, it's a natural reaction. Give us an honest picture of what we're like. That's why the Psalms are so valuable. But let's go on now. Let's go on to how Jesus used the Old Testament. Matthew 5:17, do turn to it, Matthew 5:17 to about 21. And if I don't repeat the same words as are in your translation, it's because I've got a different version of the Bible. Do not think, Jesus says, I've come to abolish or destroy. The word destroy is the same as abolish in Hebrew. The law and the prophets. I came not to destroy, abolish, but to complete or fulfill. Same word, complete, fulfill, mean either, to fill them out. Now, in Jesus' time, the expression the law and the prophets meant the whole of the Hebrew First Testament. Okay? And then we look at Jesus' life, and we see that he broke some of the rules there. And the Pharisees got very uppity, and the scribes, and Jesus said, hang on a minute, the law wasn't made for itself, it was made for the benefit of man, a human being, sorry, I must be more inclusive. It was made for the benefit of persons. But the word law can mean three other things in New Testament times. It can mean the Ten Commandments. It can mean the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible, the Pentateuch. Or it can mean the scribal law, which the scribes in the intertestamental period, they worked out all the rules and the regulations from the first 5 books of the Bible of how to behave in every situation in life. There are 63 volumes of that stuff in the Talmud, but let's not get diverted there. Now, what Jesus is saying is the purpose of the law is to bring wholeness and complete and healthy community and individual living, God's way of life. And if you try to ignore one jot or tittle, it is, and I brought a jot and tittle along if you want to see what they're like in the Hebrew Bible, he says, you're doing wrong. What is Jesus saying? Is he saying really you've got to keep the law about hairstyles for men? Or clothing, that you mustn't mix your woolen and linen garments? No, when he talks about the law and fulfilling out the law and the prophets, what Jesus is saying, not one iota of God's purposes for the blessing of mankind will fall to the ground until all his purposes that the law and the prophets speak of will be fulfilled. So that's the first thing I want to draw to your attention. We could go on about the Pharisees. They made rules, thousands of them, or it was the scribes. Incidentally, the Pharisees put aside everything in life to keep all the rules in the law, the thousands of them. They had the misunderstanding, I believe, forgive me if you're a Pharisee, that past failure of Israel was they hadn't kept the laws of God. And they thought the solution was if you kept every jolly law and if the whole nation turned to God, then they wouldn't be occupied by Romans. None of the problems they had would exist. That's the Pharisees for you. And in so doing, they became hypocritical, incidentally. Jesus talks about Korban, looking after your aged parents. But they said, oh, you don't have to pay to look after your aged parents if you've devoted that money to God. And then they made the rules about divorce easier. And what Jesus said to them, he quoted from Hosea 6:6. He said to them, I don't want sacrifice, I want compassion. The purpose of the law is for God's compassion and blessing to come through to all humanity. But let's go on. So that's Matthew. Now if you turn to Luke chapter 9 and find the Transfiguration, someone tell me where it is, where I haven't written down the verse. Just before the Transfiguration, Jesus took took the disciples aside, went north to Caesarea Philippi for a bit of a breather, and he said to the disciples, now tell me who the people think I am. And then he said to them, who do you say I am? And Peter said, you are the anointed one, the Messiah, the Christ, the Son of the living God. And Jesus immediately told them after that, you would have to compare with the other Gospels, he told them, the Son of Man, I must suffer and die. And Peter said, no, in Matthew, the Matthew version. I don't think he does in Luke, but stay in Luke for a moment. That will never happen to you. And Jesus said to him, get behind me, Satan. We know that. And then, I think it's 9 days later or a few days later, he took them up into the mountain to pray, it says. Luke is the one who tells us he took them up into the mountain and he prayed. And if you like, Luke is giving us a picture of what happened when Jesus went up a mountain. He went up to be with his Father and to think through his work, his life, and his ministry. And as he prayed, Luke says, Moses and Elijah appeared. Learned theologians say, yes, they represent the law and the prophets. Yes, and Jesus had come to fulfill the law and the prophets. But there's something even sharper there. Moses and Elijah were two people in the history of the nation who had an unusual death. Or one doesn't seem to have had a death. Moses went up to Mount Nebo on his own to see the promised land, and he died there and God buried him. No one knows where he's buried. Elijah was taken up to heaven in a whirlwind, in a chariot of fire and a whirlwind. And the point is this, Jesus has told the disciples that he has got to die at the hands of the scribes and the religious leaders in Jerusalem. What does he do up the mountain? He is dialoguing with the great saints of the Old Testament to find the direction in his life. And what do they conclude? The way out for Jesus is not a chariot of fire or some marvelous deliverance. He must make his exit at Jerusalem, and that meant certain death. So that's how we can use, if Jesus used the Old Testament like that, It can sort of feed into our minds by the Spirit of God in several of the dilemmas that are presented there that you don't find in the New Testament. But let's go on. The third instance of Jesus using the Old Testament is found, as we were discussing wonderfully in church this morning, warmed my heart, the temptations. Jesus went into the desert. And why did he go into the desert? He wanted, obviously, to think about his ministry and what was coming. And he knew he wanted to fill out the law and the prophets. He knew from the law and the prophets Israel had been in the desert once, and they'd failed miserably. So after he'd been there a long time and prayed and thought, he has a temptation. Satan says, make these stones into bread. Feed yourself. And Jesus says no, on two accounts. He is fully man, and he's not prepared to use his divine gifts for his own advantage. That may be one explanation. But he wants to prove that in the wilderness experience, where Israel failed, it is possible to succeed. So, second temptation, up a mountain. Bow down, worship me, and you can have it all. What does that mean? Compromise, and you can get your end far quicker. I think that's a temptation we might all experience. And the third one, and I must rush on because there's too much to get through. No, the vicar's shaking his head. Is get up to the top of the temple, chuck yourself down, you'll be fine. You know you'll be fine. And Jesus refuses to use the miraculous to win people's allegiance. And we know we can't do that. But if you're a vicar, if you're or politician or whatever, you can do the sensational in order to win allegiance. Disaster. Jesus turned all that down. So there is a brief example of how Jesus used the Old Testament. And if he used the Old Testament, the First Testament, I suggest that there might be some use in it for us. Read it, get to know it. I was brought up in the Plymouth Brethren, and oh dear, I was taught some strange things. But one thing I thank God for was they taught me the Bible, and they taught me to recite great chunks of the Bible. And Jesus was most certainly a rabbi. A rabbi, they wouldn't have called him rabbi, the religious leaders. You know what a rabbi did? He had to recite the whole of the first 5 books of the Bible, the Pentateuch, off by heart. There's a goal for you, but I'm not suggesting. Now, let's go on to this sheet of blue paper I've given you, that one. The Jewish Bible, which starts at the back, obviously, because it's the other way round. Do pick that up and look at it if it amuses you. Organizes the books of the First Testament, the Old Testament, in a different way. They call the first section, the Pentateuch, the Torah. It means literally instruction. Incidentally, this is just cut and paste and slightly altered from Wikipedia. Wikipedia does wonderful level articles, introductions to the books of the Bible. Some are a bit more wacky than others, but there's plenty of other sources who will give you extreme positions, and it's all there. So there we have it. They regarded the first 5 books as the law, the Torah, as they called it. The prophets, and in that, if you compare that with the Christian version on the right-hand side, they had the books of Joshua, Judges, Samuel, Kings, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, not Daniel. He wasn't considered a prophet. That's very odd. The Christians changed that around. They put Daniel in with the prophets. If we have time, we will discover why. And then they had the minor prophets. But it's odd that Joshua, Judges, 1st and 2nd Samuel and 1st and 2nd Kings are called the former prophets. I thought they were history books. We'll get onto that in a minute. And then the major prophets. Let's think about the prophets. I don't know if I ought to go back a bit. I feel I ought to say, will you forgive me, Vicar? Wind backwards. I feel I ought to say something about the contents of the Pentateuch, particularly about the creation stories. In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. Do you know that? Yeah. That's a bit difficult to swallow. Please remember that was written at a time in the first millennium BC when there was an Akkadian creation epic, a Sumerian one, a Babylonian one, and then the Greeks came along. And the state of affairs on earth is the result of conflict or interchange with all these deities. So you go running around the appropriate. Genesis 1 in that context says, no. In the beginning, one God created the heavens and the earth. And the state of the world is not dependent on what the gods are up to at all. The state of the world is the outcome of man's behavior. That's what makes Genesis 1 and 2 very powerful. So there are the flood stories, but time doesn't permit. Let's go on to the former prophets. Joshua, Judges, Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings. If you turn to the last sheet here, the handwritten one, you will see the books lined up on various big words. Don't worry too much. These books have been organized, all the historical material, to hang round three major prophets. I didn't think Moses was a prophet, you say. Yes, he was. Deuteronomy 18 says, a prophet like to me God will raise up. How many prophets were like unto him? Samuel was in one sense, Elijah was in another sense. They were three prophetic figures who called the nation together. They had that sort of authority. And the whole of the history of 1 Samuel through to 2 Kings hangs round those prophets and what they said and what they set in motion. And there are other little prophets in between who influenced the course of history. In other words, in the mind of the Jewish writer, we know this because there was a chap who edited these texts in the middle of the 6th century BC, and his style of writing is quite distinctive, and it happens in Deuteronomy, it happens at Samuel, it happens at Elijah. So he's been trying to organize the material, but the general thrust of that historical chunk of material is this: the most significant people in the life of this nation are the people who speak the mind of God. I better not say any more because we'll get diverted. Forget that. So that's why they're called the former prophets, those books. The latter prophets, the big ones, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and not Daniel as in the Christian version. Well, I just want to give you a brush stroke of each one. And this becomes a bit bitty, but we've only got a little time. What's the time? 4030, good Lord. Isaiah, one significant feature of his book is he develops the idea of Messiah. All the kings of Israel and Judah were failures, barring a few. And the people longed for a time when there would be a king who would rule justly and administer the affairs of the nation properly. And the idea of Messiah arose that God would send in due time someone who would do just that. In Isaiah 7, 9, 32, and in other parts of the Old Testament, Psalm 72, Psalm 110, and Psalm 2, this person is presented as a king with power. who will definitely take things in hand. But in the second part of Isaiah, which was written some 200 years later, I think, yes, I wasn't there, in the time of the exile, the idea of Messiah changes quite dramatically. This figure that God sends along is not a king, he's a servant. And unlike many of us when we become politicians, he doesn't blame anyone for the state they're in. He takes on the griefs, the mess, and the pain that people are in. He identifies with the people, and he's prepared to die for them. Isaiah 53. There are 4 servant songs. Isaiah, look it up on the internet. So, with the passage of time, the idea of Psalm 2, a king, that his foes shall lick the dust and kiss his feet, all that's out of the window. Okay? So, Isaiah twists the notion of Messiah into a different direction that resembles Jesus a bit more. Jeremiah, he was interesting because Jeremiah lived when the Babylonian armies besieged Jerusalem in 589 and before. He lived before. He said to the people, it's no good saying we've got a covenant agreement with God. He said he would live in Jerusalem among us and we shall be safe forever. Not a bit of it, he said. The covenant, the agreement you have with God for you to be his people has been broken several times, and it's not fit for purpose. In Isaiah, in Jeremiah 31, he says we need a new sort of law. Not one that's about external writing and keeping rules, but a law that's written in people's hearts. That's the Hebrew way of saying attitude. That's what needs to happen if we are to be God's people. And that's a significant contribution of Jeremiah. There are loads of things besides. But let's go to Ezekiel. Turn to Ezekiel chapter 1. Ezekiel now lives after Jeremiah, and he's meant to be a priest in Jerusalem, but he's taken into exile, the 70 years of exile, and there's a time chart among your sheets if you're lost. And in that time of exile, I guess Ezekiel, who thought he would be a priest because he was just 30, the right age, that is in the doldrums. And it says, look at verse 1, it says, I look north. Well, I sometimes look north, I look south, east, west. Why did he look north? North was the road to Jerusalem from where he was. And Ezekiel wanted news of the temple and all the rest and all what was happening there. Not much, really. The place was a ruin. He longed to be in the presence of God in Jerusalem, worshipping in the temple, doing his priestly bit. Now, forgive the generalizations, I haven't got time to substantiate it all from elsewhere. And instead of news, he sees a horrendous sort of vision of a chair on wheels, on casters, much like an office chair, wheels within wheels. It can go and move in any direction, and lo and behold, God is on it. And God is coming down the road from Jerusalem on his mobile throne to meet with Ezekiel. You see the development of thought. Messiah, not a political military animal. Our relationship with God, something from the heart. God only in one place? No. God is everywhere. And the rest of Ezekiel is permeated with the Spirit of God saying to Ezekiel this, that, and the next thing, and the presence of God with him, and visions, and so on and so forth. So that gives you a bit of a feel of the major prophets. Are we all right for another 5 minutes? I wanted to give you an example of this. Every prophecy in the Old Testament, incidentally, has an application for the time it was given. Very seldom does God say something about the future that's totally irrelevant to the present. If you want to understand how Jews understand Isaiah 53, go to Rashi.com. Rabbi Shlomo Yitzhaki, known as Rashi, wrote a commentary on the Old Testament just before the time of the Norman Conquest, sorry. So that's 1040. And there he will give you an interpretation of what the Jews understand by all the Old Testament prophets. It's very enlightening. You can find it online. It's all there. So I can't say anything about the prophets' prophecy, but let's go finally to the writings. The writings, well, just a few brush strokes. The writings in the Jewish First Testament comprise the Psalms. A few things about the Psalms. The Psalms are all poems. In fact, a third of the Old Testament is poetry. And if you're making precise doctrinal statements out of poetry about how God behaves, be very careful. Season of mist and mellow fruitfulness, close bosom friend of the maturing sun. It tells you nothing about when autumn runs to or whatever, but it tells you something about autumn, that the fact that it runs from 21st of September or 21st of December doesn't tell you. It tells you something about autumn that reaches parts that data cannot reach, but so poetry. The Psalms are prayers, and the Psalms are all, they're not unpremeditated prayers, they're all written out prayers, there's a place for that. Most of them, probably all of them, were sung. There's a place for music. Music reaches parts of us that words cannot reach, as does drama, dance, and all the other sort of apparently non-productive activities of human being. As the anthropologist would tell you, they're the toolbox for surviving in life, celebrating death, and all that. That's telling me to move on. The Psalms have some horrendous cursings in them. Why are they there? They're not justified. They give us a picture of the human soul at its best and at its worst. And one thing I want to say, if you want to be angry, use a psalm, ideal. The psalmist will find curses that you wouldn't think of. Use God as your sick bucket rather than going and vomiting over your neighbour and destroying your relationship with them. It's a good start for getting over what's irritating you. And the Psalms are an ideal picture of what you do to people if you oppress them and don't listen to them. They also show you the heights that a human being can rise to in worship and prayer, but no time. Proverbs. Quick word about Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and Songs of Solomon, and then one more sentence, and we're done. Proverbs is a collection of sayings from chapter 8 on, a bit like a stitch in time saves 9. They're wise, practical sayings. And it was the sort of literature that was around in Egypt before it was around in Israel. Proverbs has an 8-chapter introduction to the Proverbs. You don't get a proverb until chapter 9, verse 1, I think. And that 8-chapter introduction tells you this. Never mind all the Proverbs, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. Now, fear doesn't mean the terror of God is the beginning of wisdom. Fear means taking God into account is the beginning of wisdom. As 1 John chapter 4, as it says, perfect love casts out fear. You can't have a relationship with God based on fear. That's no relationship. If you have a relationship with your partner or your children that's based on fear, that's no basis for a relationship. The taking God into account is the beginning of all wisdom. And wisdom in Proverbs is so subversive. In chapters 1 to 8, wisdom is personified as a woman who was with God before the world was created. Hang on a minute. Genesis chapter 2, woman was created out of the rib of a man. Very interesting, isn't it? That's a bit subversive. Could go on. And guess how Proverbs ends? Chapter 31, the sayings of Kim Lemuel. I know it's patronising in today's terms, but in the time of Proverbs, it was a bit of a sort of dig in the ribs. True wisdom, he says, is finding a good wife. Proverbs, Ecclesiastes and Songs of Solomon are a bit of a sort of polemic against the figure of Solomon, the historical figure. Ecclesiastes, nearly there. There's nothing new under the sun, says Ecclesiastes. And then he says, vanity of vanities, everything is empty. If you start with a premise that there's nothing new under the sun, anything I do, it's been done, no wonder you get depressed. What Ezekiel and the New Testament and the Old Testament tell us, God is always doing something new. So, if you start from that perspective in life, you end up with life being pretty pointless. All right, he does tumble to it by the end that actually the main thing in life to do is to enjoy the work of your own labour and enjoy, guess what, life with your wife. And that's all you can expect. And to remember God. And Songs of Solomon, ask me in private, but Rabbi Ibn Ezra, also writing at the same time of the Norman conquest, and Rabbi Rashi said, Songs of Solomon for the first time, well, it wasn't the first, said courageously, this isn't a sort of a picture of Israel and God and a sort of a parable, and this is, and all the church says, the bride of Christ and Christ. This is erotic love poetry, which God, which God has created and is to be loved and appreciated and enjoyed and all the rest. But the sting in the tail, if you follow Rabbi Ibn Ezra, is this. Songs of Solomon, that's not the proper title. The title in Hebrew is Songs to End All Songs for Solomon. And in the last chapter of Songs of Solomon, you get this person, this young girl who's been in the king's chamber and who's trying to seduce her and make love to her. He says to his shepherd lover boy, who's, a bare-footed poor man, he says, enough of him, I really love you, off we go. And if you read the last chapter, she says something like, Solomon has got 1,000 vineyards. He had 1,000 wives, remember? And he's got all he wants. She says, my vineyard is mine to give to whoever I want. Goodbye, Solomon. Right. Now, the last thing I want to say, that gives you a bit of a flavour, I hope, of the whole Old Testament in First Testament. First thing and the last thing I want to say, and I really have finished, is this. Throughout the Old Testament, there is a modification of ideas. And I'm not going to elaborate, I'm just going to read the verses. Joshua chapter 5, is it, or 6? Joshua said to the son of Achan, why have you done this? He stole the gold from a defeated city, and God said he wasn't to do that, and Israel was defeated. And they blamed the defeat on Achan. And he confessed. And it says, So they bought Achan, son of Zerah, his sons, daughters, donkeys, sheep, tent, and all that he had to the valley of Achor. And then Joshua said, "Why did you bring this trouble on us? The Lord will trouble you this day." And they stoned them to death, and they burned them with fire. Ezekiel chapter, whatever it is, verse 18, is it 19? The word of the Lord came to me, saying, "You shall no longer use this proverb, 'The parents have eaten grapes and set the children's teeth on edge.' As I live, says the Lord, this proverb shall be used no more. Know that all lives are mine, and the life of the parent as well as the life of the child is mine, and it is only the person who sins that shall die." Slight contrast. Next contrast. You remember, Israel, you are my people. Isaiah chapter 19, verse 25, 20 to 25. The Lord has made himself known to the Egyptians, and the Egyptians will know the Lord on that day and serve him with sacrifice and offerings. They will make vows to the Lord, and the Lord will strike them. You remember he struck them, the same word used in Exodus, with horrible plagues. He says the Lord will strike them with healing. So they shall return to the Lord, and he will answer their supplications. And on that day, Assyria will come to Egypt, and Egypt into Assyria, and he calls Egypt and Assyria my peoples. Remember the reading about the destruction at the conquest of the land. At the destruction of Ai and Jericho, you read these words, Joshua 6. They devoted the city to destruction by the edge of the sword, all in the city, both men, women and children, old, young, oxen, sheep and donkeys. End of Jonah, last verse. God says to Jonah, right, I've preached to the Ninevites, smite them. And God says, why should I smite a city in which there are thousands of people, men, women, children, and cattle? Let's just stop there. There is a whole process of modification of thought as the Old Testament, First Testament goes along. It's not something that be categorized into sort of very nice, tidy boxes about doctrinal statements. And the last thing is this. In John's Gospel, Jesus speaks of truth as something that's done. It's not something that's believed. Many believed in him, but Jesus wouldn't commit himself to them because he knew what was in them. Jesus invited disciples to follow him, not to sign up to a doctrine of infallibility or anything like that. He invited them to follow him, and as they followed him, they discovered that Canaan, this was an extraordinary man, and they saw other things, and that's why they believed in him. And why I believe in the First Testament, the Old Testament, is sinner that I am, and I am a big sinner if only you knew, the Old Testament has been sustaining in the way that we've hinted at throughout life. It's a priceless treasure. Priceless treasure. I must stop there. Sorry, I get excited and have to praisey and praisey. It probably sounds like a whole lot of old gibberish, but there we are. We must stop.